Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. We'd like to thank you, our honored guest, our keynote speaker, Marie-Claude Lhomme. Today, she will be giving a talk on collocations and other lexical combinations and terminological resources. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us at the inaugural conference, AmericaLex inaugural conference. So thank you for accepting our invitation. And Marie-Claude Lhomme is a full professor at the Department of Linguistics and Translation at the University of Montreal and a member of the Observatoire de Linguistique Sans Texte, a research group she has headed for many years. Her research topics are terminology, theory, and lexical semantics, as well as corpus linguistics applied to terminology. She supervises the development of multilingual terminological resources, DICO-INFO, DICO-ENVIRO, and a frame DICO-ENVIRO. She's the author of a French book in terminology, La Terminologie, Principes et Techniques, and the second edition was published in 2020, and an English book on the applications of lexical semantics to terminology, published by John Benjamins in 2020 as well. She was the co-editor of Terminology for almost 20 years. So thank you very much, Marie-Claude. Everybody's looking for your talk. So if you want to start.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And well, I'm happy to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts about a topic I've been working on for, well, let's say a couple of years now. Thank you. Special thanks to Adriane. It's a pity I can't be with you in Brazil, but I'll try to make this as clear as possible. So the thing is, you know, when I use the full presentation mode, I can't see you anymore. So perhaps you might want, if you want to stop me at some point, just tell me because I can't see you. All right, so this presentation will be about collocations or lexical.
Professor, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you make the presentation mode, please? Because it's on slide mode. So if you go to presentation mode and make it bigger.
Let's see. Well, it's on presentation mode on my computer. The only thing is I don't know how to do this. Oh, I think I do now. Let's see. No.
It's okay. In case you don't, it's no problem. It's we don't see it in presentation mode though.
Yeah,
but
well,
it's okay.
No, but
let's carry on.
Yeah, I could try to find out the way to do this.
Yeah, we can. It's usually there is like a little camera thing on the top at the top bar. I I can't see because it's too small. It's down there. It's down there on your right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is like a little camera thing.
Yeah.
You can click on that.
Well, there's one called, well, I have the French version. There's one called Present. Is that the one?
Yeah, Present, right?
Yeah.
Let's see.
No, now I'm stopping.
No.
So I need to share the screen, and then.
It's okay. No big deal. I think we all can see it. It was just, an attempt to make it a little better.
Yeah, that's a pity.
No, but that's okay. We can still see it.
Yeah, but there's certainly maybe during when I.
All right.
And how about this? This isn't this. You still don't see it in presentation mode?
No.
It's strange because
You do.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. Let's just move on. It's okay. We can see it. Don't worry.
I can do it this way, so then you.
Yeah, that's better. Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. It's a tool. Yeah, it's a new tool for me. So, all right. So this presentation will be about collocations, lexical combinations that terminologists have been interested in. And I'll also talk about some methods that terminologists have developed to encode these, represent these combinations in resources. So this is a very general outline of the presentation. First, I'll say a few words about why terminologists have become interested in these lexical combinations, and also how much do these combinations differ from the ones that lexicographers are interested in, and if they differ from these combinations. And then, and this will be the main part of the presentation, I will mention some different methods. I will describe different methods to encode and retrieve and code combinations in specialized resources, retrieve combinations from them. I'll go over some early proposals and then look at some more sophisticated one. I will address issues related to access and presentation. Of course, a lot can be said about this, and I decided to focus, given the time I had, to focus on one application that we developed to locate translations of specialized combinations in resources. I will also mention some resources, some terminological resources, but I'll focus on two of them, two resources that we developed at the University of Montreal. So the first one is the Dico Enviro, so a resource that contains environment terms, and another one, Dico Info, that focuses on computing and the internet. But first things first, I might just remind you, say a few things about the typical approach taken by terminologists when they describe terms in a specific domain. So for instance, terminologists typically take a concept-based approach. So this means... Sorry, there was some noise in the background. So this means that if they have to work on a field like climate change, they will delimit concepts precisely. So each concept will be delimited based on its relationships with other concepts in the domain. So for instance, climate will be distinguished from a neighboring concept, weather. It will be related to other concepts like climate change, global climate. The relations can be labeled as well. So for instance, climate undergoes climate change, or the climate change affects the climate. So once this delimitation of concepts has been made, well, terminologists will start defining terms based on this analysis. Now, this is the kind of description that results from this kind of analysis. This is a term record extracted from the Food and in Agriculture Organization portal, a terminological portal. This is the entry for climate. So each entry or each term record describes a specific concept. The definition explains this concept. Typically, we have one definition, or if we're dealing with multilingual term records, more than one definition can be provided. But again, we're talking about what we're trying to do is describe one single concept. In this term record, a related term is mentioned, microclimate, but the nature of the relationship is not made explicit. This is another example taken from a thesaurus on the environment, the Gemet thesaurus. Again, this entry describes a single concept. The definition explains this concept. Here in this resource, we list a high number of linguistic expressions used to label this concept in different languages. And we also have some related terms, and some of these relationships are labeled. So we mentioned that some of these terms are narrower or label a narrower concept than climate. So of course I could give many more examples, but I think these two examples show that of course these kinds of resources provide valuable information, but the focus is on knowledge. So as I said, definitions are there to explain concepts, to explain knowledge. The relations that are given are said to be established between terms, but in fact they are established, defined between concepts. So there's very little and sometimes no linguistic information at all. So sometimes the only linguistic information that these resources provide is the indication of the part of speech. Now, given this concept-oriented approach, most or all entries are described nouns and noun phrases. So the question we might ask, given the topic of this presentation, is, well, how should lexical combinations be added to these kinds of resources, knowing that describing lexical combinations is focusing on linguistic phenomena? So, why have terminologists become? Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I've been trying to tell you, but you couldn't hear me. Now you can.
Yes.
Now we can see the slides because they were the first slide. So now I think that's changed. Yeah, finally.
So do you see them in presentation mode or not?
Now we can see that moved. But
okay.
It was stuck in the first slide. Sorry,
Oh.
I couldn't tell you. I sent you a message, but you were concentrated. Sorry.
All right.
Well,
the issue is that I'm using the presentation mode, but you can't see the presentation mode, do you?
Actually,
no.
If she could go to presentation mode first and then share the screen.
Oh yes, the idea is, yeah. Could you hear that?
Oh yeah. So I'll stop sharing.
Then go to presentation mode.
Presentation mode. But if I do that, I can't see. Anybody. I can't see the screen anymore. I can't see the tool anymore. That's the problem.
That's the problem.
She's a Mac user.
Are you a Mac user?
Nope. No, PC.
You can use alternating tab, Alt tab.
Tab.
Okay. Let's try this. No, Alt tab. I go back to the. Let's see.
Yep, and then you share your presentation.
Yeah, and then you can share your presentation, please.
Let's see. No, I can't. I'm sorry. I'm clumsy, but I just can't.
Well, we don't need to see the presentation mode, but maybe if she could just, if the slides change,
so you can show
would be
your
better
slides without going to presentation mode.
Yes.
That would suffice.
Presentation, so we have the file here, so we can just.
Maybe to, yeah, I think it's possible. Do you know how to do this? Yeah. Could you send me your presentation by email, please?
Yeah.
Great. I think it's more practical then.
All right, I just sent it. And don't be scared, there's a lot more than what I planned to present.
No worries.
Okay.
Nice. No.
Deixa eu vamos somar os dois.
So we're proving once again that presence is always better.
So we are at slide 8, right? And now?
I'm not sure. Let's see.
I guess so. Where's
Go to
it?
present first before sharing the screen.
I'm sorry?
Go to present first.
Here.
Yeah,
Yeah, 8.
No, no.
up there.
Where is it?
Here.
Oh, that's how different.
Apresentação de slides.
Okay.
Apresentação. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And now you add tab, and then you go to the StreamYard. It's here, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And now you go apresentar. Compartilhar tela.
Na verdade,
And janela. And so you have to see. I'll try to go to presentation.
Here?
Para. Mais fácil. Volta no StreamYard. Melhor.
Já estava aqui, apareceu aqui.
Vai aqui, apresentar slides. Adicionar seu computador. Enviar um arquivo, isso é mais fácil. Provavelmente em downloads. Yes.
Mas agora vai... Ele vai aparecer.
Just a few seconds.
Okay. Then we're using this one, right?
Yeah.
It's ready already?
não, esse aqui você pode fechar.
Esse fecha. This one too.
Uhum. Aí a Regiane que vai apresentar, ela que vai controlar.
Mas aqui não tá ainda. Mas a Regiane que vai controlar? Claro.
Porque ela é o host.
You can close it. Okay, so now it's already there.
Agora como que a gente faz para
Isso. Desce.
Ah, ok.
Pode ser você.
Aí agora vocês que tem que ir passando para frente. Isso. Slide 8. Okay, right? Now, is it correct? Can you see the screen, Michael?
Yes, perfectly. And I can see you much better.
Ah,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry about this, and thank you for your patience. So now I will talk about, well, say a few things about why terminologists have become interested in lexical combinations. So can you move to the next slide, please? So in fact, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, resources, terminological resources focus, most of them focus on knowledge. And this was even more the case a few decades ago. But some users of these resources needed more than explanations for concepts, and especially translators. Translators would have questions like, what are the typical verbs that we can use with something like climate? Okay, can we say in English, the climate changes, the climate fluctuates, the climate cools, the climate warms, and so on? Another typical question would be, can the climate change be translated into le climat fluctue in French? Okay, and the resources didn't provide answers to these questions. So next slide, please. So authors and terminology, some paper were published at the end of the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s. Terminologists or people working on terminology started to become interested in this topic. And one of these papers, written by Haidt and Freibert in 1991, showed that in fact there were some preferences, some specific usages in specialized domains. And they used the French example, créer un fichier, to explain that in the domain of computer science, if you want to express this idea of create with fichier, you have to use créer, even if other options are possible. So créer would be preferred to things like élaborer, développer, or définir. Now, adding to this create example, the interesting thing is that if you want to express this idea of create, again, in the field of computer science, you would use different verbs depending on the noun you apply it to. Okay, so this time using English examples, you would use create with file, but with application, you would use develop. With program, you would use write. And with parameter, you would use define. So all this tends to show that, we're dealing with specific usage in specialized domains. Next slide, please. Now, another topic in which terminologists became interested in is trying to see if the specialized lexical combinations differed from the ones that lexicographers would consider. And if they did, how much do they differ? Okay, next slide. So one of the, so what this slide tries to show are the kinds of multi-word expressions that are considered in lexicography and the ones that terminologists would consider. Of course, in lexicography, I think it's much more complicated than that, but still, lexicographers would be interested in compounds, and if we're talking about English, phrasal verbs, so things like railway and set up. Lexicographers are also interested in collocations, so things like ask a question, heavy smoker, and idiomatic expressions like bury the hatchet. Okay. Now, in a dictionary, these multi-word expressions would appear in different places, but somehow lexicographers will try to provide descriptions, will try to include those and provide descriptions for all these multi-word expressions. Now, if we look at, oops, you went a little bit too fast. Yeah, if we look at the terminology side now, the picture is quite different. Terminologists are interested in multi-word terms, and typically these multi-word terms are noun phrases, so things like operating system and greenhouse effect. And these multi-word terms would appear as headwords, exactly like single word terms, and would be defined as such. Now, as I said a little earlier, terminologists have become interested in collocations and would try to encode things like edit a file, endangered species, and or powerful program. Now, if we look at these two, at the kinds of groups that lexicographers consider and the kinds of multi-word expressions that terminologists consider, it seems that a very important feature in lexicography is to identify an interesting multi-word expression. It has to do with non-compositionality or semi-compositionality, but this is not something that terminologists consider. Edit a file, powerful program, or even atmospheric gas are compositional. Okay, so next slide, please. So perhaps given this, well, terminologists have used different ways to label these combinations. So some of them have used collocation, but it seems that terminologists are interested in groups that differ from those considered by lexicographers. So the prototypical definition given for collocations in lexicography are multi-word expressions in which the base or the keyword keeps its usual meaning and the collocate acquires a new meaning within the collocation. So a typical example is heavy smoker. Another typical example given is, or examples given are black coffee, café solo, to show that, well, since we're dealing with semi-compositional expressions, well, they can't be translated word for word. Now, if we look at combinations or more specialized combinations, things like valid password, create a password, we see here that this semi-compositionality does not apply. Okay, we're dealing with compositional expressions, but terminologists would still want to encode these in resources. So perhaps because of this, some authors have used co-occurrent or co-occurrence to label the phenomenon, perhaps have under the impression that they were dealing with something more flexible than lexicographical collocations. And these would apply to things like have or suffer from a disease or file a complaint. And finally, terminologists have also used phraseologisms or the expression I've been using up to now, specialized lexical combinations. Next slide, please. All right, so what kinds of lexical combinations are considered in terminology? They typically have two basic components, so a base and a keyword. And the specificity or the specific aspect is that this base or keyword corresponds to a term in a specialized domain. Okay, so something like disease in medicine, impact in environment, or internet in computing. The second component can be called a collocate or a co-occurrent, and this would be something that combines typically with a given term. So suffer from a disease, have with impact, or browse the internet. In terminology, the base is a noun, and this is compatible with a tradition I mentioned earlier and compatible with this concept-oriented approach. And the collocate, since the base is a noun, the collocate can be a verb like have a disease, an adjective like significant with impact, or another noun like administration with password. Next slide, please. Looking at this, again, on this question of are specialized lexical combinations different from general language ones? We can look at this from a different perspective. And this is what we did with a former student of mine. We tried to find out if corpora could give us a little insight into this question. So what we did was compare collocations in two different corpora. So we used a specialized corpus, a very large specialized corpus on climate change. And we also had access to a general language corpus. So it was a combination of the British National Corpus and the American National Corpus. So we carried out our study on 15 nouns, and this list was, so we identified nouns that appeared in both corpora, and we established this list based on their specificity in the specialized corpus, in the climate change corpus. So we obtained things like climate, energy, water, and so on. Next slide, please. Yes. So what we did, we extracted collocates for all these 15 nouns, extracted collocates in 3 symmetric window sizes. So this means we had 6 different lists. So 3 lists from the general language corpus and 3 ones from the climate change one. And we applied an association measure, the simple log likelihood measure, and we examined the 51st collocate. So what you see in this table is the top list, so examples of the lists we obtained. The top of the list we obtained for climate. So on the left-hand side, we see the first candidate collocates extracted from the environment corpus with a window size of 3. And on the right-hand side, the candidates we obtained from the general language corpus, again for climate with the same window size. So we looked at a certain number of things. I will only mention 3 of them. But the first thing we looked at was how much overlap there was between the lists we obtained in the climate change corpus and the general language ones. So the overlap ranges from temperature, where there was a 54% overlap, to 19% overlap for climate and system. So in these figures, we merged all the lists. We didn't take into consideration the window size, and we didn't take into consideration the rank. Okay, so the most overlap we had was 54%, and the lower figure we obtained was 19%. Then for those collocates that could be found in both corpora and the same window size, we looked at the rank they obtained, and we observed even more differences. So here is an example of what we saw for climate in a window size of 1. So the change is the only collocate that has the same rank. It appears in first position in both corpora, but looking at the other collocates, the ranks change, and some of them pretty drastically. So for instance, current appears at the 50th position in the environment corpus, but at the 7th one in the general language one. So another thing we looked at was how these collocates, what kind of meanings they profiled. And this was also interesting. So what the slide shows is what we obtained for what we saw for climate. So the circles in gray and white show a meaning profiled by collocate. So the meaning, the weather conditions meaning. So we see that things like change, dry, variability profile that meaning. And that's the only meaning which is profiled in the climate change corpus. That meaning is also appears in the general language corpus and profiled by things like sunny and change. But in the general language corpus, another meaning is profiled by collocates like financial, social, and economic. So here we're talking about the general atmosphere. All right, so what we know now, in fact, it seems that, well, there's a general consensus to the effect that it's a good idea to encode specialized lexical combinations in terminological resources. Users find it useful to have information about groups that are longer than terms. They find it useful to be able to access information as to how terms combine with other units. Okay? There's also a general consensus to the effect that there are some combinations. Some combinations are preferred in specialized domains. Now, regarding this issue of the difference between general language combinations and specialized ones, well, it seems that the kinds of multi-word expressions considered differ, that the criteria used by terminologists or lexicographers also differ, and that if we look at this question from the perspective of corpora, the corpora do not tell us much about the nature or the different natures of the groups considered by terminologists or lexicographers, but it does show that, in fact, there are some differences in terms of prominent collocates, differences in terms of meanings profiled by collocates. And also what it shows is that lexicographers and terminologists working with these methods working with corpora and extracting information with measures, would probably encode different kinds of collocations in their resources. Next slide, please. Of course, there are some unresolved issues. This idea of preferred usage in a specialized domain is very difficult to explain, especially since terminologists do not apply this idea of semi-compositionality. Should we rely on frequency? Should we try to guess what users need, what the kinds of things they would look for in terminological resources? And one issue I haven't mentioned, but that is extremely important and probably was implicit in some of the things I said, is how do we distinguish collocations from multi-word terms, okay? Is atmospheric pollution a multi-word term or a collocation? Is endangered species a multi-word term or a collocation? So these are still open questions, okay, that haven't been really resolved in terminology. So now I will talk about, even if there are some unresolved questions, I will talk about different methods that have been developed to add these specialized combinations to terminological resources. So an early proposal was made that consists in, well, the general idea was to say, okay, you know, we already have these nice resources. We have term banks with many, many term records that describe millions of terms. Why not add this information to existing term records? Okay, so this is an example with the French term logiciel taken from the Termium Plus term bank. So some data categories are well known. We have grammatical information, usage labels, definitions, but some data categories were added, PHR, and these data categories contain different lists of collocates of words that combine with logiciel, and they are organized based on the part of speech of the collocate. Next slide, please. So this is a very similar example. So here we have, but this is a printed dictionary in the field of the internet. So again, here we're organizing collocates based on their part of speech. The only difference is that we're taking into consideration the function of the noun term. Okay, so there are two separate categories for verb collocates. Next slide. Yeah. So, well, the format here is not has changed, but I'll try to explain this. This is a slightly more sophisticated example. So this is taken from a dictionary compiled by Betsy Cohen. It's a printed dictionary on stock exchange. So again, we have this organization, this classification of collocates based on the part of speech but we also have a classification based on the general and abstract meaning of the collocate. So we have categories like beginning, growth, reduction. So, and these were defined as categories that apply to collocates in this field of stock exchange. So this is another example, but this is an online dictionary. This is one of the dictionaries that we compile at the University of Montreal on the environment. So here we also wanted to organize collocations based on their meaning, but the solution found differs from the one that we just saw, the one applied by Betsy Cohen. So this is an example of some collocates that were listed under the entry for species. So what we do is list the collocations and show their structure, like the species becomes extinct, the species disappear. But on the left-hand side, we provide a sort of very general explanation of the meaning of the collocate. So the species ceases to exist. So we're trying to find ways to explain the meaning and explanations that would apply to other terms in this domain of the environment. So, of course, if we're dealing with online dictionaries, we can also think of different methods to access information about collocations. And what this slide tries to show is that, well, instead of just accessing this information based on the head word of a term record, we can also try to access all the term records in which a collocate was declared. Okay, so in this example, the user is looking for a lexical relation, entered, endangered, and this will retrieve a list of entries in which endangered was defined as a collocate of a term. Okay, so endangered animal, endangered bird, and so on. Next slide, please. All right, and this is another, again, always on this topic of rather early proposals or basic proposals, but here we are, it's a different way of presenting lists of collocates. So here the presentation is in the form of a graph. These are the collocates listed in one of our resources for the term habitat. So users can access the explanation if they click on edges, and they can also regenerate graphs if they click on a full node. All right, so how am I doing on time, since I lost a lot of time with technical issues? Adrienne, how much time do I have left? I can't hear you. So I go on? Yeah. Right, so I will look at some methods. So up to now, a more sophisticated method. So up to now, I presented some methods, collocates that were classified based on their part of speech, based on their meaning. But we can also take this step forward and take into consideration more properties, more features of collocations. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an example taken from a business dictionary developed by Binon, Verlinde et al. So it's a multilingual dictionary, but the long entries describe French terms. So what I did here is try to translate the definition given for bien, good. And what I'm trying to show here is that this classification of collocation takes into account a different kind of property. So collocations will be classified depending on the participant or the argument that controls them. So if we look, oh, sorry, the previous slide, please. So if we look at the definition, good is defined as an object created by an economic agent. So this is labeled with the X, so the first participant, first argument, and that is used for production or to fill the need of consumers and companies. And this second participant or argument is labeled with Y. So if you look at the table, some of the collocations are controlled by X. So produce a good, sell a good are things that are controlled by the first argument. But if you look at the second list, things like request a good, buy a good, acquire a good, this is controlled by the Y. Okay, so this is yet another way to classify collocations that has been used in specialized dictionaries. Next slide, please. All right, so this is something we also implemented in one of our resources, but we did this slightly differently. So this is an entry, the entry for password that was that appears in our CONF dictionary on computing. So we don't, this entry doesn't have a definition, but we do state an argument structure. So a password is described as something given by a first argument to a second argument to act on a third argument. And if you look at the, now the animation didn't work, sorry about that. But if you look at the collocations, some of them point to the first argument. So the user starts using a password, enter, and type. This is controlled by the first argument. If some of them are linked to the second argument, so if you look at something like check a password, ask someone for a password, this is linked to the second argument, the provider or the computer. And finally, some of these collocations are linked to the third argument, okay? So things like access something with a password, okay? So again, ways to organize or present information linked to collocations, but using this third property, the one that the relationship with the argument structure of the base or the keyword. Next slide, please. All right, so in fact, so what I showed up to now using these examples are different presentation methods based on different properties of collocations. Okay, so part of speech. Yes, Adrienne, do you want to?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So how much time do I have left?
Now you have about 17 minutes.
Okay, and that
19 minutes. Yeah.
And that doesn't include question, or does it?
Yes, and then we can open for questions. Okay.
Okay, so I would, yeah. Okay, okay. So just if I'm still going on after 15 minutes, just tell me again. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So so what I tried to show with these examples are the different properties that can be used, or the different methods that can be used based on properties of collocations to present them in resources. And now I will explain how we can, how terminologists can encode collocations using all three properties. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so there's a formal system that allows us to take into consideration all these properties. We don't have to show this formal system to the users, but for encoders, this formal system is very, very useful. Okay, so this was developed, these are lexical functions developed by explanatory combinatorial lexicology. I will explain them using examples that we have in our resources. So, sorry, the previous slide, please. So on this slide, what I'm trying to illustrate is, well, internet can appear in different combinations, different collocations, and the ones that are illustrated here are browse and search for. Okay. I will assume that internet has two arguments, is something used by someone to act on something, okay, to find information, to find a web page, and so on. Okay, so internet is defined as the base or the keyword, and browse and search as the collocates. Next slide, please. All right, so looking at these collocations, the structure is different. So in the first one, internet is the first complement, but in the second one, internet is the second complement. But looking at their general and abstract meaning, they do both convey this typical uses of internet. Okay, so we'll want to encode that information somehow, and to encode the fact that they appear in different structures. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so the other thing that we want to take into consideration is the fact that each collocation points to different arguments. Okay, so browse the internet points to the first argument only, but the second collocate, search for something on the internet, points to both arguments. Okay, so that we will want to represent that as well. Next slide, please. So this is how we would do this using lexical functions. So real is used for collocations where the base, in this case, internet, is first complement, and lab real is used for combinations where internet is second complement. They both convey this general idea of typical use, but for different structures. And you can see the numbers there that indicate the relationship with the argument structure, okay? So we have a system here to take into account all three properties that I mentioned, okay? Meaning, structure, and relationship with the argument structure. All right, next slide. So this is very quickly another example. Here we have risk in the field of the environment, assuming that risk has three arguments: risk of something, on something, so an area, for instance, from something, a cause. Assuming that risk can be found in can combine with pose and be, and both these verbs are empty verbs, okay, support verbs. They do not convey full meaning. It's risk that conveys the full meaning. The pose and risk simply allow us to use risk in a sentence. Next slide, please. Okay, so the only difference between these two verbs, because we're dealing with the same structure, we're dealing with the same general and abstract meaning, is the relationship with the argument structure, okay? Pose a risk is linked to the cause of the risk, and be at risk is linked to the thing, the area, or the species undergoing this or suffering from this risk. Okay, so we would represent this. We would represent this with lexical functions like au pair 1 and au pair 2. Okay, so perhaps one last thing regarding these lexical functions is that they are language independent. So even if we explain them differently in French and English, so real, for instance, would be explained in English as used, in French as utilisé. We would use the same lexical function to encode things like move a mouse, browse the internet, or in French, déplacer une souris, naviguer dans l'Internet. Okay, we're always dealing with the same structure, the same general meaning, and also pointing to the same argument in the argument structure. Yes, next slide, please. All right, so very quickly, I will show how we can apply. There are many, many ways in which we can use these lexical functions, again, without showing them to users, but I will try to show how we can apply this to translation or finding translations of collocations and resources. Right, so what we did, we identified a specific problem and for our resources, and we identified specific user needs based on user needs defined in functional lexicography. So what we wanted to do is allow users to access the translation of a specific collocation, so for instance, in English, in French, or Spanish, and retrieve the translations of the entire collocation if they are available in the resource. Okay, so for example, we wanted to allow users to type something like send a file as an attachment and retrieve envoyer un fichier en pièce jointe. Okay, or enter a French collocation like supprimer un fichier and extract the English translation, delete a file, or the Spanish possible translation, borrar, eliminar, or suprimir un archivo. So the important thing to know is that we in our workflow, we work on languages when we develop our resources. Each language version is developed independently from the others, okay? So we do establish equivalence relationships at the level of head words. So we would say, for instance, in the entry for attachement, we will say that we will say that this translates into French as pièce jointe. But we do not translate collocations one by one, and we didn't want to do this, okay? So from the point of view of the user, we wanted to allow them to extract combinations, but we didn't want to change our workflow. We didn't want to start translating each collocation. Okay, so how can we do this? Next slide, please. So this is what we want to obtain and that we did obtain, and then I'll explain how this is done. So this is the search window implemented in our Dico info, and users can type something like move a mouse and would obtain different kinds of results depending on different kinds of results, since mouse can appear in collocations where it's first complement, but also in collocations where it is second complement. Okay? So if you type move a mouse in our resource and choose the expression functionality, you will obtain the explanation in English, but also one translation in Spanish, mover un ratón, with the explanation, and then 3 options in French, déplacer, faire glisser, and manipuler une souris. Now, these 3 verbs in French are not synonyms, but it's interesting to see that they within that context, within that collocation, they convey the same idea. Now, the system will also retrieve something like move something with a mouse and suggest 2 translations, déplacer quelque chose avec une souris or positionner quelque chose avec une souris. Next slide, please. All right, so this is how it's done. So we have entries for English terms, entries for French terms. As I said, we do establish equivalence relationship at the level of head word. So we'll declare that souris is the equivalent of mouse and that mouse is the equivalent of souris. Then what we want to do is allow users that are looking for a specific collocate of mouse to identify the translation in French. So this is how it's done. Now the animation is not working. I'll try to explain this. So behind the scene, what you see in the white screen capture is how these collocations are encoded in our resources. So they're encoded in XML. And so you can see that one information that we give is this lexical function that I said was language independent. So users see the explanation, but behind the scene, the collocation is encoded with a lexical function. So it's encoded with real1. So what the system will do is simply look for real ones that were encoded under souris and extract the corresponding collocation. So it will extract déplacer, faire glisser, and manipuler. Next slide, please. Perhaps I will skip this one since I'm running out of time and move to, next. This is too bad because the animation hides everything, but I'll try to explain this, and this will be the last thing I will talk about. Using this idea of lexical functions and the fact that we encode collocations with lexical functions, we thought we could take this one more step and identify missing collocations in our resources. Okay, so as I said earlier, our workflow consists in working on language versions independently. So this means that we will end up having lists of collocations in English that can differ from those that we listed for French, and that can also differ from collocations that are listed in Spanish. Okay, so this so we have some gaps that this table shows. So for instance, for disturb the ecosystem, we have the collocation in English, but there was nothing in the French version, okay? So what we did is extract all this information, identify the gaps, and then look for translations of disturb in existing resources and validate the equivalents that we found in corpora and add these collocates to our resources. Now I see Adrienne, I guess this is a signal for me to I can't hear you. I don't know if other people can. 5 minutes? Okay, well perhaps I'll just conclude. We can move to the
Adriane, você que precisa ativar o seu microfone.
Yes, I still have 5 minutes, Marie-Claude.
Okay, but I'm almost done. We can move to the next slide. These are the conclusions, and then we can we manage even after the technical problems. Okay, just to summarize. What I tried to show was, well, different methods to add specialized lexical combinations to terminological resources. There's a general consensus to the effect that this is interesting and useful. It contributes to enrich specialized resources. There is a growing number of resources that encode longer expressions. Sometimes collocations are simply added to these resources without changing the their overall structure. In some cases, compilers will, or designers will rethink the structure of resources. Now, one of the consequences of this work is that sometimes this affects the approach to the description of terms. Okay? So this, and I think this is a positive effect, taking into account the behavior, the linguistic behavior of terms. The behavior of terms as text is positive. Sometimes it leads to make fine-grained distinctions that would escape corpus-based analysis. But it does raise this difficulty I mentioned earlier regarding the distinction between multi-word terms and collocations. Next slide. As far as general language and specialized combinations are, the differences between these are concerned, there is a consensus to the effect that they do differ to some extent, but perhaps these differences are linked to the approaches taken by each expert, or perhaps these differences are linked to the way that the corpora were designed. And finally, last slide. Of course, I've covered very little. A lot of work has been carried out regarding specialized lexical combinations. People have worked on ways to have studied combinations as ways to better understand the meaning of terms instead of looking at ways to add them to resources. Some authors have used combination to identify relations between terms, and some authors have worked on combinations to identify text genres, to oppose, for instance, popularization texts to scientific genres, and so on. So perhaps I will stop here, and I thank you for your attention.
Marie-Claude?
Agora eu abri.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's start. I got clapping in our hands. Yeah, we're clapping our hands and you couldn't hear us.
I did. Actually, I did. That's very, very, very rewarding considering that I'm in Montreal.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was an inspiring talk. and I'm sure that people are motivated and highly motivated to study specialized collocations from now on. So we have a few questions, I think, on the chat, but we had problems with connection. So I'll see if I can handle with those questions. Oh, there is a question here. Okay, Davi Souza is asking if possible, he'd like to hear from you discussion about the relationship between phraseology and terminology, especially regarding the case of specialized complex units. So where would specialized phraseology be in this realm?
Well, I assume that by specialized phraseology, what is meant here are kinds of idiomatic expressions used in specific subject fields like law or something like that. This is what something that would differ from the combinations I've been talking about in the presentation. So assuming that this is the case, it is, to my knowledge, there's little work that has been done, or perhaps there's work that has focused on specific areas of knowledge, like law, or areas of knowledge where these phraseologisms appear. Now, I mentioned earlier that terminologists did use phraseology, and we did see this on this Termium Plus example, that the data category is labeled PHR. So there is a little bit of confusion in the terms used. Phraseologisms have sometimes been used, phraseology or phraseologism has sometimes been used to talk about specialized lexical combinations or collocations, but it seems that there might be other kinds of groups that have not been studied that much by terminologists, but that would certainly be interesting to look at. And perhaps one last thought, I think phraseology would be interesting to look at in terms of text genres as well. There might be some ways in which different kinds of expressions, different ways to express knowledge, depending on the text genre. This is not work that I did myself, but this is work that is done in terminology. I hope I've answered. I haven't answered, I'd only raised some perhaps more issues. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me check if there are questions here for the guys who are in person here. I particularly have to say that I was going to ask you a question, but you said that it's unresolved. Remember, we discussed about how we could distinguish specialized lexical combinations, for example, from multi-word terms, right? But then you have already replied that, because I remember when I was defending my PhD, one of the professors asked me the same question, and he said, "Okay, we don't need to answer that if we don't want to, right? Because it's a tricky question, which maybe in the future, because I remember that we discussed that in 2019, and I thought to myself, maybe Marie-Claude already hasn't replied for that, because I still don't, but..."
Well, in fact, it has a lot to do with the approach taken to the descriptive approach taken. Okay? So if you use a concept-oriented approach, you would normally consider these adjective plus noun or noun plus noun groups as multi-word terms, okay? Because they label a specific concept. But if you take a corpus-based or a more linguistic approach, then these combinations are it's much more difficult to say that we're dealing with multi-word terms there, because they're compositional. Endangered species, they vary a lot, because you can say the species is endangered. Okay? So I tend to look at those as collocations, but a concept-oriented terminologist would probably say, and told me before, these are multi-word terms. So it depends a lot on the approach, actually.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, thank you very much. Do you have questions? Any questions? No questions from here? No? Okay. All right, David, the guy who asked that question, said that he's got, a good answer. So he's thanking you for answering that. And my God, we have to thank you very much for being here with us. We learned a lot from all you've shared with us. It's a highly interesting research, and I'm sure that the audience will reflect on that later on and read some of your papers and books. So it was a great pleasure to have you here with us for the AmericaLex inaugural conference. Thank
All
you.
right, so enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to clap our hands again. Thank you. And it's really a pity you can't be here with us, but maybe in the near future it will be possible. Okay? Okay, have a nice week. See you.